To go ahead and open in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. Today we start a brand new series called Promises Fulfilled. Promises Fulfilled. And, I don't know about you, but it seems like every year Christmas and the Christmas season gets busier and busier and busier, doesn't it? I don't know about you, but I also seem to make resolutions each year that this Christmas, it's not going to become about the commercialized holiday. Right? Do you do this? Like, it's not going to become about the presents. It's not going to become about the stuff or even the family events. All those things are great, but I'm really going to focus in and lock eyes with the real meaning of the season, celebrating Jesus' birth and his coming. And it seems like every year I set out with such great intentions of doing that. And then each year, at some point along the way, I realize, wow, I haven't met my goal, right? I've gotten caught up in who do we get what and when do we get what and where are we going now and whose party is when. And man, it just seems like you get to the end of Christmas and it's like, it becomes very little about Jesus' birth and his celebration of his coming and so much more about everything else. And so this series, I wanted to start a little early. I know some of you haven't put your Christmas tree up yet. Most of you haven't, right? Like if you have, then we'll talk after. Okay, but like I wanted to start early because here's the thing. I wanted us to go ahead and get our minds right as we start to think about Jesus and his coming, as we celebrate Jesus and his coming. And so one of the ways I want us to do that, we're going to go through Matthew's version of the Christmas story. We're going to go through Luke's version of the Christmas story. And over the next several weeks leading up to Christmas Day, we're going to look at the promises that Jesus fulfilled in his coming. And so we're going to take a little time just to pause every Sunday to think about Jesus and who he is and what he did and all the promises that he fulfilled in his coming for you and for me. And we're also got some special stuff planned. We've got some things in our community groups from here until Christmas to be able to help you focus on the real meaning of Christmas. And then also on November 27th, we're going to be releasing an Advent devotional that you can do together as families. If you have young kids, you can do it with your kids. If it's just you, your husband and wife, single people, everybody can go through these devotionals together. It'll be every day from November 27th until December 25th. And so for just 5 minutes a day, you can just take a pause and remember what this is really all about. It's about Jesus and his coming. I love this verse from Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. It says, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Listen, I want to tell you, when God makes you a promise, you can take it to the bank that he's going to fulfill it. Now, it may not be in the timing that you think he should fulfill it. It may not be in the way or the method that you're expecting him to fulfill it, but I want to tell you, that's exactly the way that it happened with Jesus and his coming too. And so we're going to look together at all of these stories and look at these promises that Jesus has fulfilled. And I want us to see, as God fulfilled all of his promises through Jesus' coming, you can take it to the bank. God's going to fulfill his promises to you. All of God's promises have their yes in Jesus. If you want to know if God is going to keep his word, look at Jesus and the birth story, and you can tell he's going to do it. And so we're going to look today at Matthew chapter 1. And Matthew was writing to this Jewish audience. He was writing to this Jewish group of people, and he wanted them to know and be convinced that Jesus really fulfilled all the promises of the Messiah. He was the one who had been promised to carry on the line of David. He was the one who fulfilled the promise that God made to Abraham, that through Abraham's descendants, the entire world would be blessed. And so Matthew's writing his gospel to these Jewish folks so that they can know and understand, listen, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these promises, all of these prophecies about the Messiah who would come. Jesus was him. He also wanted people to know that it wasn't just that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but he was Messiah for everybody. And so as he started out his gospel, he decides he's going to present this in a certain way. Now you might think, okay, if this is his goal, he really wants people to know all these promises that are fulfilled through Jesus in his coming. He wants people to know he fulfilled all the promises of the Messiah. He wants people to see that are Jews and Gentiles. You might think that he would start out with like the miracles of Jesus, right? Look at all these miracles that the Son of God did. You would think he might start out with like this unbelievable story of blind men becoming seeing men. Or maybe he would start out with like the wise men, right? People who have come from afar and then they're bringing these unbelievable gifts and treasures to worship at the feet of Jesus. Maybe it's something like that. But if you look at how Matthew starts it out, he starts it out very differently than you and I would. Look at what he does. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. He starts it out with a family tree. He wants this genealogy of Jesus to be the very first thing that he uses to showcase, hey, God fulfilled his promise through Jesus. Now, any of you done any family tree history stuff? Anybody? Nobody. Fantastic. One person. That's great. You don't know who your family is? That's okay. Most of us don't. Listen, all I know is that the Teague family somehow means like rough Irishman, but I'm not rough. So I don't know exactly how that worked out, but somewhere along the line, I know there's Cherokee Indian in my family. I know that there's German ancestry. I know that there's Irish ancestry. Like you name it, like we're in there somewhere, okay? And so I think I got all the bad parts of every one of those groups of people. Like I've got a fiery Irish temper, like, right? It's in there. It's just sort of part of who I am. And so like you want to look at your family history, and it tells you a picture of where you've come from, right? I remember I had one of our church members go back, and he was an Ancestry.com guy. And so he was like, just tell me your grandparents' names. I'll see what I can find out. And so he went back generations for my family, and he came back to me, and the first thing that he said was, did you have a lot of drunks in your family? And I was like, I don't know, maybe so. I mean, that sounds probably about right. But listen, I want to tell you, Matthew, he starts out his promises to show, hey, look at all these promises that Jesus fulfilled, and he starts it out with a family tree. Now let me ask you, if you were trying to convince somebody that Jesus was the fulfillment of the David's throne being passed down forever, if you wanted to convince somebody that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Messiah and the promise to Abraham that through him the whole world was going to be blessed, like what parts of your family tree would you highlight? And what parts would you leave out? Like as you're presenting things, as you're making this case about, think about a job interview, right? Like you're showing up with your resume. Like, are you going to put the time where you work for 3.5 hours? Like, is that really going to be something on it? No, you're going to leave all the bad things off your resume. Like you've got references, right? Are you going to put the people who are like, you'll never work in this town again, right? Are you going to stick those as references? It's like, well, I just want an honest opinion about myself. So here's a great reference, and here's somebody who's going to throw me under the bus. No, you would never dream of doing that, right? But I want you to see something here. Matthew starts to list out these people, and he's just totally and brutally honest. Like he's almost like a middle schooler, right? It's like, I'll tell you the truth, but I'll tell you even more than the truth. Like I'm going to tell you the truth in such a way that I could care less about your feelings, right? Like this is what Matthew does. He just dives in and he showcases this unbelievable truth about who Jesus really is. And so let's look together at what he's trying to reveal to us and how Jesus has fulfilled these promises through his family tree. I want you to see what he says. Here we go. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. All right, so far we're starting out pretty good on the family tree. He's got the highlights, right? Like he's the son of David. He's the one to carry on the throne of David that was promised him, that there would always be somebody on the throne from his family line, and it would go on forever and ever and ever. He says he's the son of Abraham. He's a child of the promise, that through him the entire world is going to be blessed. Like starts out pretty good, but look at what happens next. He starts to go further. Verse 2. And Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Again, like you're reading through and you're like, all right, these are like heroes of the faith. I mean, forget that Abraham like lied about his
wife being his wife a couple of times because he was nervous about himself, and he's like, just say you're my sister. It'll be okay. It'll all work out, right? Or maybe the part about Isaac playing favorites, right? And it's got Jacob and Esau. He really loves Esau, but the wife loves Jacob the best, right? And so they kind of are going back and forth. Then you get to Jacob, and it's like, well, how did he get his blessing? How did he end up here? He was the second-born. I thought I was supposed to go through the firstborn. How did that happen? Oh, that's right. He stole his brother's birthright. Oh, that's right. He cheated his dad, right? Do you remember the story? Like, he puts on goat hair and he pretends to be hairy like Esau, and he goes in, he changes his voice, and he gets the blessing from dad. So now he ends up in the line. So in the line of Jesus is this cheater who actually weaseled his way into the family tree. It shouldn't have been through him, should have been through Esau, but there he is. He weasels his way in, and then he says in Judah. Well, Judah seems like a great guy, right? I mean, even names of Jesus, right? The Lion of what? Judah, right? Comes from the tribe of Judah. Well, let's keep going. Here's what it says, verse 3. And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by who? Tamar. That's weird. Like, when you're listing out a family tree, Matthew's generation and the way that they would have done, they would not have listed women. This would have been just the dads. So what's this story about? Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram. Like, we can just read through this, or we can sort of dive in. Why is Matthew listing this guy out in this way? Why is he listing Tamar in this way? Do you know this Old Testament story? We're going to have story time with Pastor Dave today. You ready? Here we go. So you can just look back through it and go to the next slide. You can write this down, Genesis chapter 38. I just want to tell you, this is one of the most graphic chapters of Scripture in the entire Bible. If they made a movie of this chapter of Scripture, it would be rated X, okay? Because it's unbelievable, the story that happens here. And so I won't magnify those things. I'll try to bring them down the best that I can, but I want you to know the story. So there's this guy named Judah, and he has 3 sons. And so he was supposed to marry this nice little Jewish girl, but he doesn't. He marries off his son to this foreign woman who doesn't believe in God the same way. Her name was Tamar. So the oldest son, they get together, and this guy is totally evil, so God looks at him and strikes him dead. Like, you got instant drama the first time. I'm so glad that the Lord hasn't done that with all of us. Amen? Aren't you thankful for grace? And so there was this Jewish tradition that if a man died before he was able to have a child with his wife, so that this woman wouldn't be sort of off to support herself, then the family would take her in, and the next brother would marry her, and then he would provide a child for his older brother. So that way the line could continue. Like the family tree, it wouldn't fork, right? Like you just keep on going. And so this was this duty of this second brother to say, hey, you know what? Like, you're my sister-in-law. I don't want to see you out in the cold. Like, I don't want to see you by yourself. And so you're part of our family now. And so I'm going to give you a son or a daughter that can be part of my brother's legacy. And so Judah marries off Tamar to this second brother, and the second brother is even more evil than the first brother. And he starts this unbelievable thing. You can read it in Genesis 38. He says, I'll take all of the sexual rights and privileges as a husband, but I'm going to make it so that you'll never get pregnant. And that's what he does. And so this woman, she entrusts herself to him. She's hoping, she's helpless. She's hopeless. She's like, you're going to have to give me a child so that we can continue on with this family line. And so every single time he takes his husbandly rights and then totally casts aside every bit of responsibility. He says, no, I'm going to make it so that you don't get pregnant. And then the Lord sees that and kills him. And so Judah starts to take this personally, like, she's a man-eater. Like, what's wrong with her? Like, he blames her. Like, it's this woman's fault, right? And so he has a third son. He's like, I'm not going to lose my third son. And so here's what he does. He says, how about you just stay a widow? Then when my little boy grows up, like, we'll marry him to you then, and you can just count on it then. But you just stay a widow for a while. Well, that happens. He just thinks she's going to forget about it, but she doesn't. Years go by. The third son is all grown up, and he's not being married off. And so she doesn't know what to do. She's hopeless. She's helpless. She's not being provided for. She's not being cared for. And she doesn't know exactly where to turn. And so this story takes a turn. Judah's wife passes away. And he's sad and he's mourning. He plans a guy's weekend trip to Vegas, right? This is what he does. He goes with his friend that introduced him to his first wife, and he's like mourning. And so he makes this trip. They're going to shear some sheep, and so they go to this town, and Tamar hears about it, and she makes plans. She's going to be in the same town. She's going to confront him about what he's done. And so he shows up at the city gate, and he sees this woman there who's dressed with a veil on her face, and he's grieving, this grieving widow, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to totally go against what God thinks. I'm going to hire this woman as a prostitute. Well, what he didn't know was the prostitute was his daughter-in-law. And so she has her veil on, and he said, I don't have anything to pay you, but here's my staff, and here's my signet ring. I'll come back. I'll bring you a goat tomorrow. And so they have their time together, and then they leave, and so she goes back home, and he's none the wiser. He sends his friend back. Like, listen how weaselly this is. He sends his friend back with the goat because he's too embarrassed. Like, he can't even man up to his own sinfulness and his own behavior. So he sends his friend back with the goat, and he's like, I couldn't find her. I don't know where she was. And get this. He says, I don't know what happened to the cult prostitute. Like, it wasn't even just that she was this prostitute. He thought that actually this physical union was a worship of a false god. So here's this guy, Judah, who his wife dies, and he tries to find comfort in a totally inappropriate way, and he links himself with this prostitute, and in it he thinks he's worshiping a false god, and the guy comes back, I don't know what we're going to do. Like, she's not there anymore. I don't know what's happening. I don't know where they are. I don't know what's going on. And listen to what he says. He actually says, well, let's just leave this alone. I'd hate to become a laughing stock. That's his thought. Little does he know that the joke is on him. And so 3 months later, this woman is found out to be pregnant. She's starting to show she can't hide it any longer. And so I want you to hear his reaction. Now remember, this guy, he's totally immoral in his own right, but he hears that his daughter-in-law has been impregnated by some guy who's not her husband. And so he calls and he says, you bring her out and you burn her alive. Can you imagine the audacity? Like he thinks what he did is fine, but what she did is totally not right. And so he looks, just burn her, right? Like, and so she has his staff and his signet ring. And she sends a message to Head. She says, maybe you can help me find the father. Now, can you imagine? This is like a Maury Povich episode right here. This is like, you are not the father, right? Like in this deal. And in his mind, he's sitting there thinking like, whoa. Like, you're telling me that you've had so much interaction with other people, you don't even know who the father is? Are you serious? Like, his anger is burning alive. And so he gets there and he's ready to throw the book at her in judgment. And then she says, here's his stuff. This guy is the father. And he looks, and it's his ring and his staff. And his thought of judgment changes really quickly and says, you know what? We should have mercy instead. Now I want to tell you something. She ends up having twins. And Jesus' family tree could have gone through any of the 5 of Judah's sons. But God the Father said, no, I want it to go through Perez, the son of Tamar. Why in the world would God say, I want Jesus' family tree to be part of this sort of crazy story where there's this immorality and craziness and sexual dysfunction and all of this stuff? Why in the world would God want his son's family tree to look just like this? Look, he keeps going on in the story. Look, verse 4. And Ram, the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of who? Read it with me. What is it? Boaz by who? Rahab. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And Obed, the father of Jesse. Look this next one. Write this down. Here's Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Do you remember the story of Rahab? She had something in common with Tamar, right? She was in Jericho, and she was a prostitute. You remember Joshua sent spies into the land? You remember the story, right? And so she hides them. Like up on the rooftop, she covers them up, and the king says, hey, those guys came in to spy out our land. Where are they? And she says, look over there. I think they're over there. They already left the city, right? And so all the guys come out and they're chasing after her. And so she lets them down and she says, listen, like I've saved you. Now, when you come in, you save my family. Now I want you to think about who this woman is, right? Like this is her past. She doesn't know God. She hasn't had this relationship with God. She's not part of God's chosen people, the Jews. But she knew who God was. And I want you to hear the words that she says. Here's what it says in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8. You can go back and look at it later. It says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and fear has fallen upon us. And all the inhabitants of the land, they melt away before you. For we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted inside of us. There's no spirit left in any man because of you. And listen to her words. This woman who's never had a worship service. This woman who's never sacrificed in a temple anywhere. This woman who's never been part of God's chosen people. Listen to her words. She says, for the Lord your God, he's God in the heavens above and in the earth beneath. This God of yours, I don't know about him. But what I do know is he's God over everything. And she says, I've saved your men. You save my family. And so what happens is, they march around. Do you remember that? Like, we're marching. And then they blow the trumpets like 7 days, 7 times. Then boom, and the walls came, what? Tumbling down, right? And so, boom, the walls come tumbling down. And her house was connected to the wall. I don't know if you know that or not, but her house was part of the wall. So every bit of the walls of Jericho are flattened except for her house that's connected to the wall. She has the velvet rope out, and she says, hey, everybody in here is safe. And so her family is safe. Well, she goes on to marry this Jewish guy. And she learns more about who God really is. And she ends up having Boaz as her son. Listen, why would this person be included in God's family tree? Weren't there other people around? Like, weren't there other people who weren't outsiders? Yeah, I'm sure there probably were, but God looks at this woman who's a total outsider, who's an outcast of society, who people look at and say, she has no value, and he looks at her and says, I want her in the family tree. Now look at the next part. Boaz, he fathered Obed by Ruth. Do you remember this story too? It's another outsider. Here's Ruth, this Moabitess woman. Her husband dies, and she goes back and she makes this unbelievable statement. She wasn't a God-fearer. She wasn't a believer, but her mother-in-law taught her about God. And so her mother-in-law says, listen, you two girls, you go back to your Moabite people. I'm going back to my Hebrew people, and we'll just go our separate ways, right? And so Orpah, I think Oprah's family missed it by one letter, but it was Orpah. Like, Orpah ends up going back to her people, and Ruth makes the statement. She said, no, I can't. Far be it from me. I can't go. Where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And then what happens? She meets this hunk of a kinsman redeemer, right? Like, and he comes and he says, hey, I'll marry you. Like, you're a catch. Like, whoa, and she actually sort of proposes to him a little bit, right? And like, and you remember the story? Read it in Ruth. And so he takes her as his wife. I wonder if he was open to an outsider because his mom or his grandma had been an outsider. And she had been included in. Like, so God includes Ruth, this woman who had been left for dead. Think about what would have happened if she would have gone the other way. No, she said, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so she goes along with them, and now she's included in the story. Look, really quickly. I know we got to go. Here we go. Look at the next verse, verse 6. And Jesse, the father of David the king. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Like David the king, like we're not talking about outsiders, or we're not talking about sort of crazy sexual deviants. Like we're talking about David the king, right? And then look at what it says right after this. And David was the father of Salmon by what? The wife of who? The wife of Uriah. Like she doesn't even give her name. It's not, and David was the wife, David gave birth to Salmon by his wife Bathsheba. No, like listen, in your family tree, you kind of want to skip over those ugly parts, right? But like Matthew just highlights it. He doesn't even say, and David's the father of Solomon by Bathsheba, his wife. No, he says, and David's the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Do you remember the story? David's married already. He's got kids already. And he should have been out at war. This guy Uriah was one of his mighty men of valor. I want you to think of it in today's modern terms. Like David was an elite fighter. He was like a Navy SEAL kind of guy. Uriah was part of his unit. And he's there and he sends them off to battle. And he chooses to stay home. And while he's up on the rooftop, he sees Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. And he says, I don't care that that's my buddy. I don't care that he's fought and bled for me. I don't care that he's a mighty man of valor. And he brings her in. And you know the story. And so then David tries to cover it up. What does he do? He brings Uriah back from the battle. He's hoping that Uriah and his wife can be together. And then he'll say, that must be my baby, right? But Uriah won't go into the house. He's like, no, my guys are at battle. I can't do that. Like that's something bad for my men. Like that would be terrible. And so he sends him on his way. And do you remember what he does? Like, think about this. David actually says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go where the battle is the fiercest, and then I want you to move back so he's all by himself, so that he's killed. And do you know who he puts this letter in the hands of? Uriah. He takes his own death letter back with him because he could be so trusted by the king that he would never open this letter. And in it, it says, kill him. And he takes it, and that's what happens, and Uriah dies, and David tries to cover it up. Everybody thinks, oh, look at the king, like he's bringing in this mourning widow into his family. That's so sweet of David, right? And thinks that everything is going to be covered up because, oh, it's King David, right? But then the Lord reveals it to Nathan. He says, you're the man who's done this. And the truth comes out. You know what happens? They lost the baby. David mourns, and they're crying. And then in the middle of this verse, it says that he comforts his wife Bathsheba. And they're together again. And through that act of comfort, Salmon becomes part of their family. Listen, Jesus could have had his line go through somebody else, right? David had other sons. Well, why would he choose to go this way? But Jesus looks at it and he says, you know what? This is my family tree right here. And Matthew doesn't cover it up. And he says, no, it was Solomon, the wife of Uriah, ends up giving birth to this son, Solomon. And it's part of David's family line. We'll keep going. Here we go. There's other good ones that are in here too. Verse 7. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asaph, Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, Joram the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham. If you're looking for boys' names right here, I'm just saying. Jotham, the father of Ahaz, Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh, Manasseh, the father of Amos, and Amos, the father of Josiah. Josiah was a great one. You remember him? Little boy king, right? Grows up, cleans out the temple. They find the word of God, and the whole country gets back to a relationship with God. He was a good one. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel, that's a good one, was the father of Zerubbabel. He came back, he rebuilt the temple. Zerubbabel, the father of Abiud, Abiud, the father of Eliakim. And you just keep on reading, right? And you go through. Verse 17, here's what it says. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14, and from David to the deportation were 14, and from the deportation to Christ were 14 generations. So why does he show us these stories? Why does he highlight these insecurities in the family tree? Like, why does he showcase the deviance and the sexual perversion and these outsiders that have been grafted into Jesus' family tree? Listen, write this down. If there's one thing that you take away from today, it's this. Write this down. Here we go. Here's what it is. God desired Jesus' family tree to resemble his future family. God wanted his family tree, all of his past, he wanted it to look like all of his future family. See, Jesus didn't come to make bad people into good people. Jesus came to take dead people and make them alive. Jesus looks at this and it's like, why in the world would he include these people? All these outsiders, all these sexual perverts, all these deviants, all these people who had totally blown it. Why would they be part of Jesus' family tree? And it's because Jesus is saying, because in eternity future, all these people who are just like them are going to be part of my family. I'm going to the cross and I'm going to pay for every one of their sins. I don't want people to think that I'm just for the rich. I don't want people to think that I'm just for the poor. I don't want people to think that I'm just for the uber religious. I don't want people to think that I'm just for the broken. I'm for every single person. That's why I came, because I wanted to come and bring people far away from God into relationship with God. And so I wanted my jacked up family tree to show everybody that would come after my birth that I want them to be part of the promise too. I want them to be part of the promise. Listen, look right here. I'll close with this. Today, are you breathing? Are you sucking wind? Right? You got air in your lungs? I want to tell you, God's promise is for you. You might say, oh, you don't know what I'm going through. You have no clue. I'm an outsider. Well, look at who was in his family, a family full of outsiders. You know, but you don't know what happened in my past. Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything about it. Like, if people saw the light of this thing, they would be so terrified and they would be so disgusted because it's horrible and it's horrific. And I can't even believe that that was a part of my life. And he says, have you seen the light that was shown here on Jesus' family tree? Jesus' forgiveness and his promise is for everyone. Even me? Yeah, even you. Doesn't matter if you grew up in a great family or you grew up in a terrible, terrible family. Look, God's family tree shows, look, his promise is open to everybody. Today, as you leave this place, remember you're a person of the promise. Jesus came through this family tree so he could include you in his big family so that you would be part of the promises of God. Let's live like people of the promise.